Today's show is sponsored by CloudZero. For software-driven companies focused on growing margins, CloudZero is the only cloud cost intelligence platform that puts engineering in control by connecting technical decisions to business results. By analyzing cloud services like AWS and Snowflake, CloudZero provides real-time cost insights that help you maximize margins. Engineering teams can answer critical questions like, who are my most expensive customers? How much does this specific feature cost our business? What's the cost impact of re-architecting this application? With cost anomaly alerts via Slack, product-specific data views, and granular engineering context that makes it easy to investigate any cost, CloudZero is your complete cloud cost intelligence platform, connecting the dots between high-level trends and individual line items. Join companies like Drift, Rapid7, and SeatGeek by visiting cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started today. That's cloudzero.com/cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And this is Aaron for Cloud News This Week. And first of all, I'm going to not talk about KubeCon. We've been talking a lot about KubeCon, but there's other things happening out here in Cloud News, and we have two other articles I wanted to tell you about quickly. The first one is a bit of a trend that's developing. Of course, the stock market is having some highs and some lows, and the global economy is certainly having some highs and lows, and depending on who you believe, we may or may not be headed into a recession. But software as a service and SaaS stocks, two in particular, Atlassian and Twilio, both announced results. And results were good in the fact that they both continued to grow, but they downgraded forecasts for the future. And because of that, both stocks just got absolutely pounded, losing in the neighborhood of 25 to 30%, if I remember correctly. And this also really highlights how this is the first time SaaS stocks have really seen a recession and a dip. And one of the theories behind these stocks was these operating models, because it's recurring revenue, might be a little bit more recession-proof than some of the others. And we're starting to see the first pressure testing of that. And I'm not sure how well that is playing out. Now, this could be just, hey, the stock market didn't love this and they decided to pound them, and other ones may follow suit, and maybe the others may not be hit as hard later on. Don't really know. All of that will play out over time. But Atlassian, I mean, they were still up 31% year over year, but it was actually down 2% from previous quarter. And like I said, downgraded forecast for the future. And so that's why they really got hit. Twilio was more about, they were still up 33% year over year, but they operated at a very small profit about a year ago, and they were operating at a loss again. So that flip back, the stock market just decided to pound them on that. So again, how will this model and SaaS stocks in particular play out over time? We don't know, but it's something we're certainly going to follow very closely. And if I move on to our second article, and I promise we're not going to talk about this on a regular basis, because honestly, this is one of those things with Twitter and Elon Musk buying Twitter, and there's new articles and new stories almost every day. So we're going to talk about this maybe once or twice, talk about some of the highlights of it, but this is not going to be a weekly recurrence of talking about Twitter on Cloud News of the Week. I will say, of course, Elon Musk bought the company, violated some laws pretty blatantly, fired a bunch of the staff, fired actually some of our friends and some friends of the show. And then some of those people, they realized they needed them. Then they asked them to come back. And so it's a bit of a shit show, if I'm being honest, over at Twitter. And then they decided to roll out a service, but then they didn't want to roll it out before the election here in the United States. And then they delayed that. And I mean, it's just kind of a cluster. It's like a cluster and a dumpster fire all in one over at Twitter. But hopefully everything will shake out over time, and hopefully common sense will prevail over time. And we certainly wish everyone over at Twitter the best. And that is going to close out Cloud News of the Week. And coming up right after the break, we're going to be talking with Marko over at SemaphoreCI on how to manage the evolution of monoliths to microservices using modern CI/CD.
Do you have petabytes of data that need to be stored safely, sustainably, and cost-effectively? Meet Fujifilm Tape. Yep, you heard that right, tape. It's a solution that's become the backbone of many businesses' archive and backup solutions. Tape allows you to store data with more longevity and efficiency than disk, and with much less expenditure over a 10-year period. Fujifilm has been pioneering innovation since 1934 and will continue to do so for many years to come. Learn more about how you can build your data archival strategy on tape with Fujifilm at builtontape.fujifilm.com. That's builtontape.fujifilm.com. Buffering. How annoying. Did you know that 17 out of 20 people stop watching a video because of stalling and rebuffering? Don't let your users click away to a competitor's site. If your business lies on online media, rely on CDN77 to deliver a seamless online experience to your audience. CDN77 is one of the leading global providers of content delivery network services. They power the world's most popular websites and apps, such as Udemy, ESL Gaming, live sports TV, and social media platforms. Aside from their massive and redundant global network, you're going to love their no BS attitude and skilled team of engineers ready to help 24/7. No chatbots, no tickets bouncing around unresolved for days, just people who know your use case and can immediately help you pinpoint and fix the problems. Don't wait until your users run out of patience. Go to cdn77.com/cloudcast and ask for a free trial with no duration or traffic limits. That's cdn77.com/cloudcast.
And we're back. And for this week's topic, we actually have a really interesting, I think, take and conversation, both on CI/CD as well as the concept of monoliths and microservices and when and how you might move from one to the other. So with me this week, I have Marko, co-founder at SemaphoreCI. Marko, why don't you give everyone a quick introduction, please?
Sure. Thanks, Aaron. Thank you for having me on a podcast. Excited to be here. So as a quick introduction, we created Semaphore about 10 years ago, and it really came out of having a bad developer experience. At that time, our company was consultancy doing web development, and kind of the key tools we used to build mostly SaaS products were Ruby on Rails, GitHub, Heroku for deployment, and a big part of the process was doing behavior-driven development. So all of these things combined, and each individually, provided a pretty amazing experience, for individual developer and the team as a whole. We really enjoyed our work, and we even made the tagline of our company, "We optimize for happiness."
Nice.
But there was this thing, like we, there's a point where you no longer kind of run automated tests like everybody on their own machine and that sort of thing. So you set up actual continuous integration process with the tool to automate it, and that at that time. The state of the art was basically setting up Jenkins on probably VPS. That's how we did it, and we were just surprised by the amount of effort and time needed to do that. It was also pretty costly if you wanted to make sure that nobody on the team has to wait for the resource. Wait in a queue. So because we've been kind of on the lookout for the idea to build a product, become a product company, that's how the idea for building Semaphore was initially conceived.
Nice. Thank you, Marko. And so it's funny because I kind of see CI/CD a lot of times as a journey, but I say that about a lot of different topics on this show, but this certainly more so than others because we always hear about the big success stories, right? Organizations that are doing hundreds to thousands of deployments a day, like a Netflix or a Twitter. A lot of the same names keep getting thrown around as like the golden standard, if you will, right? But many, even the ones I mentioned, didn't start out that way. Some didn't even start with microservices, right? Some started as monoliths, very, very famously, and moved into microservices. But the whole reason they did is they had to outgrow that monolithic architecture first and get to a point that it was really, really painful. Is this common? Is this something you see a lot?
I think it's a very common. In fact, I think I've found there is. Nobody has really. It's hard to get like data to back it up, like substantial data. But people like Martin Fowler, have been saying that pretty much all successful stories of microservices-based architectures, started from a monolith, and the reason, just like you said, basically, that somebody came to the idea that of moving to microservices was that monolith for a number of reasons was becoming too big, probably because the product or in the company were quite successful, had a lot of users, or something that was causing a large heavy load. And I think it's on the other hand, I've become very skeptical of any story that's like based on kind of in the second paragraph, the reference is like one or a couple of huge companies, and like because it works for them, like here's why it's also a great idea for you. I think 99 point something percent of the people and companies are not those companies and have in very different contexts. And yeah, it's very. I think it should be kind of looked at with some amount of skepticism, but there's lessons to be learned from there as well.
Yeah, and so you bring up a really, really good point there. Maybe let's even step back because I do feel like the monolithic architecture is made out to be a villain at times, and microservices, is always the winner or the hero or the champion, but that's not always the case. It's more about trade-offs, right? Because I think monoliths, especially in the beginning, might be easier, and so tell everyone a little bit about the trade-offs between monoliths and microservices. Let's start there.
Sure. So there's there's a tremendous difference in the amount of effort needed to start a project when you compare the two approaches. I think there's very little support for the idea that like new products, like with new teams or in a new company, should start microservices first. And that's because it's just vastly more complex, to design those systems from scratch, comparing to just following the common kind of guidelines and ideas that are found in the popular web frameworks, which are pretty mature nowadays and contain basically either built in, or there's a lot of advice in the community which has been battle tested about how to structure a code, how to make sure it's modular enough, so that whatever comes at you in the future, it's not too much trouble to refactor it, potentially repackage it, extract it in a separate service, and so on. So kind of going back to okay, on the fundamental level, of course, monoliths are, at least in the beginning, generally easier to extend. Once the developer is comfortable kind of navigating the code base in a monolith, they can be extremely productive. Very small teams can frankly build little miracles, if they are if they know their framework and the language very well and have clear kind of understanding of the problem. The tool chain is very mature, so you can go from a blank project to a working pipeline and the production deployment in less than an hour. Whereas with microservices, there's just much more decisions to be made in everything from how you package your code and test it and structure it, and the data models, and pretty much everything except for a decision and a discussion in the microservices world. And that's very hard to get right if you don't already have a monolith which went through a number of iterations to get the fundamental things like the data model of your system and some boundaries in the correct shape.
Sure. And Marko, let me ask you this then, because to get maybe just a bit more prescriptive on when you're talking about those decisions, what are some of the guidelines to building a successful microservices strategy, and how does both your background and then building SemaphoreCI, how does all of that help organizations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we at Semaphore internally, we have also went through a journey of from monolith only to microservices. What pushed us, for example, was that basically a cloud-based CI product is dealing with vast amounts of machine-generated data. And so it's even though for comparing to some maybe popular or consumer grade kind of applications, it didn't take us to some astronomic number of daily users to get to a point where keeping this monolith up and running was becoming increasingly difficult. And for us, there was we basically identified one area of the monolith which was the most problematic. That was dealing with logs at that time, which really needed to be moved out of the monolith and kind of have a life on its own, so that it doesn't bring the entire everything down, from the sign up page to some basic screens. So I think once you encounter those problems, it really depends on the organization where you are. But some of the common kind of guidelines that I would share in order to be prepared to make a jump, which by the way doesn't have to be a full splash. You actually can maybe just extract a couple of components into microservices and keep most of your code still in a monolith. That can still work.
And Marko, let me follow that up with then, because I really like that idea of you introduced some concepts there of splitting up a monolith, right? And that can be probably many different ways, right? It could be a business function. It could be a single point of failure you want to reduce. It could be some kind of technical boundary within the application. It could be you just want to keep the size of the development team smaller. Like how do you recommend approaching I'll use the term, the low-hanging fruit, right? The easiest pieces to pull out?
Right. I think what's what is common for both both a good microservices-based architecture as well as a monolithic architecture is that the design is good. So the design meaning parts of the system are loosely coupled. There's this idea of bounded context. So things are in the microservices context. That means that microservices are independently deployable. But in the case of monolith, I think the very important kind of preparation is, in case you haven't done it already through just the way you're working, is to modularize it. So, have some boundaries in the code, like not have modules or classes like bleed into each other. Preferably talk over public API of modules and classes, and have good abstractions in place. Make sure that you have enough automated testing going on, which is triggered by CI pipeline on every change in source code. And if those kind of basic building blocks are in place, then you can kind of start by having, for example, an API gateway in front of your system, which would in case when you extract maybe or you don't even have to extract, like in the beginning, the first microservice is probably going to be some kind of a replica in a microservices form of what you already have in monolith, and you don't want to remove that part of the monolith. You actually want to reroute for a while through API gateway that piece of functionality and kind of see, test it out in an isolated environment first, later in production. And so you want to kind of chip away at like the rough edges, so that until your monolith is something that's potentially is just like some, good enough and lean enough that maybe you don't have to chip away anymore, or you just end up with completely replacing it. That's really up to each organization to figure out.
And what, in this journey from monolith to microservices, what are some of the first advantages seen, right? Because one of the big things with a lot of these projects is, at the end of the day, you're not reinventing the wheel. You're basically taking functionality and almost making it the same. And yes, there should be some incremental improvements in there, and there should be advantages there. But how do you prove success to the organization?
Yeah, that's a good question. In what you just described, that you're not building anything new for a good amount of time. That's the big reason why this decision needs to be taken very carefully. I think in practice, the first advantages should be along the lines of, that part of the system has finally become stable, or finally we can deploy, more often the part of the system where we really need to, because usually, this comes up as a topic once a monolith is really big enough, hopefully. And so big monolith means I'll probably long time to get feedback from CI. Maybe the test suite is, maybe there are some flaky tests and you have to rerun stuff. And it just kind of adds up to like maybe you have a 30-minute build and you have to rerun it once or twice. And so as a developer, you can only deploy a few times per day suddenly. And for your organization, it's really not a good situation, because maybe the company is growing and it wants to add more developers, but the monolith just keeps getting more and more intimidating and more fragile maybe, and harder to deploy. Kind of depending on like why you started, it could be, I think, kind of going back to that, like maybe the burning part of the system has become more stable, and later on it should be once you've kind of internally become comfortable building microservices, it should just be more easier for maybe new developers to be onboarded and get productive, as opposed to a very steep learning curve in a large monolith.
Okay. Yes, and that makes perfect sense. And I'll ask you kind of one last question here, because I see this again in this journey spectrum. I see that, like, okay, there's an advantage, but then something else pops up within the organization, right? And developers, at the end of the day, this is enabling developers, and they just want to go fast and they just want to automate all the things. But then I can see other parts of the business, once this microservices strategy is built, then what about governance, and what about compliance, and what about security, and what about, cost of the resources being used? Like, let's say if you're doing a deployment in public cloud, and because a lot of time developers don't necessarily think about the costs behind something like that, right? And so these are all, the results are developers go fast, but this shifting left comes at a price, whether it's of actual, monetary in dollars or euros, or in compliance or security or risk. And so how do you weigh those and also keep the organization, once they achieve success, from getting bogged back down?
Yeah. It's there is a price for sure. All of those things that you mentioned. Something that we actually haven't mentioned previously, but is also worth having in mind. I think oftentimes, it's not an easy topic, but the organization that was that built a monolith, that engineering organization probably doesn't have any idea how to build microservices, and it's a very expensive learning curve. And so, for example, from at Semaphore, we just did it anyway. But in practice, I think a lot of companies that start that, like, they probably maybe raised a new round of funding, and so they have some fresh resources to invest, maybe hire some people, bring in some fresh expertise. There are definitely trade-offs. So one thing that's also more complicated is if you are building a product and you need to ship an on-prem version. That's more difficult when it's a microservices-based architecture, comparing to if you could just ship it as one container. And everything is just things are more complex. Like, this is like, personally, like, this is why I would kind of always advise people to start with a monolith and just kind of the classic, maybe web development stack, because there is generally more complexity involved comparing to just firing up a web framework you're comfortable with, and just building something that solves a problem.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thank you for that. So Marko, with that, I'm going to close us out for today. Where can everyone, if this is interesting to them, if they want to go learn more about this or about SemaphoreCI, Where can everyone go to learn more?
Well, Semaphore has recently published an ebook about transitioning from monolith microservices. So it contains a lot more information than what I could really convey today. And so people can download it for free at SemaphoreCI.com/resources. And if anybody fancies strike a conversation, feel free to hit me up on Twitter. I'm Marko A, and we'll happily reply to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And I'll just add this as well. The link to both the resources page, because there is other resources as well. They're great resources. And I did take a look at the book, and when we say it's an ebook, you're not kidding, Marko. It's a good 70 pages. I mean, it is not a light, fluffy document, and it's a very entertaining read. So I highly recommend it to everyone.
Yeah, thank you. It's not a 20-page font 24 ebook. It's
right.
Yeah.
Yes, it is a real ebook without a doubt. So yes, I would encourage everyone to check that out. And with that, I'm going to close us out for this week. So on behalf of Brian, who wasn't able to make it this week, thank you to everyone for listening. And if you have any feedback, please let us know. Easiest way is either Twitter or email, and links to that are in the show notes. And also, if you're enjoying the show, tell a friend, leave us a review as well. And for that, I'm going to close this out, and we will talk to everyone next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.